It's Renee Conroy, and I am pleased to invite you to think with me some more in this, the fourth post of our slow read series focused on Agnes Callard's Aspiration, the Agency of Becoming, which is presented by the Purdue University Northwest Philosophy Program. Now, the nature of proleptic rationality, which was the key concept introduced at the end of our last post, should become clearer to us as we proceed through several important philosophical puzzlers that Callard develops and discusses in parts 2 and 3 of the book. Today we're going to focus on a particular one, the nature of intrinsic conflict, or the state of being genuinely psychologically divided against oneself. But before we examine this special issue in the field of moral psychology, let me say just a little bit more about how Callard understands proleptic reasons. Then we can dive right in and start thinking about love-hate relationships and what it's like to fight against yourself. So last time, I described proleptic reasons as having two faces, a proximate face and a distal face. The proximate face is the way the reason presents itself to an aspirant when she still can't fully understand how or why it's a reason and can't apprehend all the aspects of the value that it reflects. The distal face, by contrast, is the way a reason will present itself to the agent when she reaches the end of her aspirational journey. It remains hazy and inchoate for her because, as Callard is often at pains to remind us, the aspirant is an active student, one who's trying to learn about as well as adopt new core values. And it's important to remember that learning something, and I mean really learning it, not just memorizing a datum to pass a test or look smart at a job interview, takes work. And of course, genuine work also takes time, which is another point Callard wants us to keep in view all the time, whenever we're thinking about the situation of the aspirant and the way that she mobilizes proleptic reasons. So to put just a bit more meat on the bones of our current conceptual skeleton, let me briefly skip ahead in the book to a description that Callard offers of the two-faced nature of proleptic rationality, which I've selected because it dovetails quite nicely with our ongoing reflection on the situation of Joan, the would-be jazz lover. So in a slightly different context, Callard writes this: let's acknowledge that the aspirant, and here today I'm reading right from the book so we can really feel the force of a slow read, that the aspirant is guided by the intrinsic value of, for example, classical music, or in Joan's case, jazz. And she's guided by this value in a different way than the person she aspires to become. The latter's response to the value is indicated by, for instance, the joy she takes in the music she listens to, her articulate sensitivity to different renditions of a piece, her regular subscription for season tickets, her disappointment when she must miss a performance, her delight in sharing love of music with her children. The aspirant, by contrast, is moved by the value of classical, or jazz, music to seek the approval of her music teacher, to commit to meeting a friend at the symphony so she'll not back out and see a movie instead, to pinch herself to stay awake through the piece, and so forth. But note that pinching yourself to stay awake isn't a mark of appreciating classical music, it's a mark of not appreciating classical music. It's a form of response that comes under the aegis of value only to the extent that we situate it in a developmental process. Pinching in order to eventually attend without pinching. Thank you. So today's question is, what is it like from the inside to be a self-pinching aspirant? Now this inquiry is both phenomenological. It asks a question about what the qualitative character of some experience is, and it's psychological, because we're focused on experiences that arise precisely when some of our psychological states are in tension with one another in a fundamental way. So again, what is it like to be a self-pinching aspirant? Well, there's a kind of internal battle between Joan's desire to sleep, she might just be tired, or she might wish to escape the experience of listening to music that she finds distressing, and her competing desire to stay awake. Her self-pinching reflects the proximate face of her proleptic reason, where the distal side is whatever it is she will grasp or appreciate when she no longer has to pinch herself to stay engaged with or even be stimulated to sleeplessness by the concert. Now, this example is useful because it gives a bit of substance to the account of proleptic rationality that we've sketched so far. It helps us see how Joan can have one reason with two faces, and it enables us to envision what those faces might look like in a particular case, thus how they could conjointly motivate or rationally explain Joan's activities when she attends the jazz concert. But Callard's example that I just read actually has another really interesting feature, insofar as Joan hasn't availed herself of any external prompts to ensure that she doesn't doze during the concert. She might have asked a friend to nudge her, or she might have downloaded an app to her phone that would vibrate painfully if she started to nod off. But in this version of Callard's case, Joan pinches herself, which I submit is a dramatic way of illustrating how aspiration is fundamentally connected to intrinsic conflict, which Callard defines on page 123 as a case where, quote, two desires conflict in such a way that their conflict divides the agent's evaluative point of view against itself. So what exactly is intrinsic conflict? Now, following our strategy as adopted in the first slow read post, it'll be most illuminating to contrast intrinsic conflict with extrinsic conflict by considering examples. And I should mention that these are Callard's terms of art, and in this case, I'm actually going to riff on Callard's own examples, which are variants of cases that were first addressed by esteemed philosopher Harry Frankfurt in his discussions of identification and wholeheartedness, which, for those of you who are familiar with Frankfurt, are the ultimate targets of Callard's discussion in this section about internal or intrinsic conflict. So, to get a nature of, or let me back that up just a little bit, to get a grip on the nature of extrinsic conflict, which Callard defines as a situation in which an agent's desires pull her toward incompatible actions, let's consider the case of the torn aesthete. I'm going to call him Aesthetic Alan. So Alan loves both classic movies and modernist classical music. He doesn't value or appreciate one more than the other. He just loves both differently, as is appropriate to their distinctive aesthetic qualities and artistic features. But on this coming Friday night at 8 p.m., Alan's favorite work by Schoenberg will be played for one night only at the local symphony, while simultaneously there'll be a single presentation of his favorite 1920s flick Metropolis at a local movie house. So Alan is conflicted. He would absolutely love to attend both events, perhaps equally, but he's simply unable to do so in light of contingencies of circumstance. How shall Alan go about deciding how to spend his Friday night? Well, there are any number of important things that might factor into his deliberative process, but as it turns out, these aren't really relevant to the case as an example of extrinsic conflict. So let's just stipulate that for one reason or another, he elects to go to the musical performance, perhaps because he can watch Metropolis at home on his big screen TV. So now here's the clincher. When Aesthetic Alan gets to the symphony hall, he discovers that the Schoenberg program is canceled because there's been a water main break in the basement of the theater. Well, now what? Well, the answer is obvious, given Alan's original conflict, which has now effectively been resolved. True to his motivational form, Alan hops on a bus headed for the movie house and buys a ticket to see his favorite Fritz Lang film. Now, what's crucial about this case is that Alan's conflict, though it is experienced by him as involving a friction between standing desires, was brought on by the world, so to speak. This is why, in the end, it was the world that resolved the issue for him when the 12-tone music performance was canceled. Now, not every episode of extrinsic conflict is like this. It won't always be the world that both causes and resolves the tension in the simplistic way it seems to in Alan's case. But setting aside complications about other kinds of psychological scenarios that might exemplify extrinsic conflict, the key to Alan's discord was just this. He had two desires that couldn't be satisfied at once, though they weren't fundamentally in conflict with one another. After all, there's nothing internally inconsistent about loving old expressionist cinema and loving atonal music concerts. So there's really nothing internally conflicted about having the desire to experience both of these artistic forms when the chance presents itself. Now let us contrast aesthetic Alan with a person I will call bitter Betty, who's an example of someone Callard says suffers from intrinsic conflict, insofar as she's an agent whose, quote, desires pull directly against one another. We shall imagine Betty embroiled in the scenario Callard dubs bitter wife, and this time I'm simply going to read her version of it so we stay true to her ideals. This appears on pages 114 and 115 of the text if you happen to be following along. So, bitter wife. A woman wants to mail her husband's letter as a favor to him, but they have a complicated relationship. She loves him, and she knows it'll make him a lot happier if the letter is mailed. Unmailed letters are one of his pet peeves. But she's also intensely bitter and angry at him for his many small cruelties toward her, his intense irritability, so many pet peeves, his lack of romantic initiative. Next to the mailbox, she sees a garbage can, and it occurs to her to spitefully throw the letter in the garbage instead of mailing it. Suppose that, in the end, love prevails over spite, and she reaches for the handle of the mailbox, but finds it locked. Okay, well, what is the importance of the fact that bitter Betty finds the mailbox locked? This is the apparent analog of aesthetic Alan's situation when he gets to the symphony hall only to find it closed for the night. But here's the crucial difference. Whereas the locked theater door resolves Alan's conflict by making it possible for him to satisfy only one of his competing desires, the locked mailbox doesn't resolve Betty's. In fact, it might even make it worse. And this is because her conflict is not at the level of possible actions, like Alan's, but at the level of seemingly incommensurable values. Now, one immediately intuitive way to parse the distinction between aesthetic Alan and bitter Betty is to, quote, suppose that the difference lies in the intentional contents of their desires, which are themselves opposed. This is Callard's suggestion, or one she examines on page 115. To put that somewhat differently, one might say that in desiring to hurt her husband, Betty desires the opposite of helping him, whereas Alan suffers no such conflict in his desires because in wanting to hear Schoenberg, it's not as though he's thereby desiring not to see Fritz Lang films. Now, Callard rejects this approach on the ground that there are general problems with individuating desires. Or to put the concern more colloquially, it's very difficult to determine how we should describe the motivating desires in both of these cases, and one can do so in ways that make them appear to be conflicted, as well as in ways that dissolve the apparent conflict, and again, one can do so in both cases. So in light of this, Callard recommends that we need to adopt a richer picture of value to fully describe bitter Betty's psychological dissonance. This will move us away from the idea that it is the contents of Betty's current desires that are opposed, and toward the idea that her discord emerges from something more fundamental, some kind of tension in her core values. Now, Callard's picture of valuing includes elements that are common to many accounts of value. It will have us think about things like Betty's beliefs, Betty's affects or emotions, Betty's dispositions to act, or her motivational set. But Callard's picture also includes an intriguing fourth component, Betty's engagement in a project that Callard calls self-monitoring, in which, quote, the valuer makes sure that her various responses to the valued objects fall in line. This is on page 120. Without getting into a detailed discussion of exactly what values are, let's see how focusing on core values as opposed to current desires might help refine our understanding of bitter Betty's case, so we can grasp more fully what Callard means by intrinsic conflict, and ultimately what she means by proleptic rationality and aspiration. So once the activity of self-monitoring enters the picture, we can start to see that it's possible that when Betty confronts the locked mailbox, not only is her psychological conflict not resolved, but it might actually become more acute. For Betty's not conflicted about how she should proceed to manifest latent bitterness toward her husband. That is, she's not confused about whether she should toss away his letter instead of give him a tongue lashing. She's conflicted because she is bitter, a fact about herself she recognizes as cutting against her fundamental desire to be a loving wife. Notice that even though she finds the mailbox locked, Betty could still do the loving thing. She could simply find another mailbox, or she could take the letter back in the house and just admit to her husband that she wasn't able to see through this particular favor. The problem with Betty, for Betty, is that she wouldn't be doing either of those things in a loving way to precisely the degree that she is bitter. Perhaps she does find another mailbox grudgingly, muttering to herself under her breath the whole while. But we needn't imagine anything as extreme as that. Perhaps she does it in a kind manner, but mails the letter purely under pressure from her dominant value to be a loving spouse. Now, it's the fact that there's pressure of this kind on the scene that's characteristic of Betty's intrinsic conflict. After all, Betty says to herself, if I were truly a loving wife, I wouldn't be bitter at all, and hence my loving self wouldn't have to dominate over my spiteful side. Of course, it might well be that Betty has good reasons to be bitter. Perhaps she's married to cheating Charlie or gambling George. But what we're imagining is not only that Betty has a deep-seated desire to be a genuinely loving wife, but also that this desire comes from the fact that she values her relationship with her husband in a fundamental way. Now, maybe she shouldn't do so, but by hypothesis she does. And given that she does, Betty should not, from the point of view of her own values, engage in activities that would tend toward the destruction of this relationship. So, when Betty self-monitors while grumbling on her way to the mailbox, standing ambivalently next to the mailbox, reaching out to discover that the mailbox is locked, she, quote, experiences a desire that her values bring her to see as inappropriate. Or as Callard colorfully puts it, this stray desire to toss the letter throws a wrench into the works of her valuational machinery. And so, quote, torn between loving tension that manifests her valuation of her relationship and spiteful revenge that inclines her to destroy it, the wife suffers from a kind of double vision. So that her choice, presumably whichever one she makes, cannot but fracture her evaluative point of view. These quotes come from Callard on pages 121 and then 122 over to 123. Now, there's a good deal of metaphorical language in those passages, but I couldn't resist quoting Callard's expressions directly because there's something quite apt about describing intrinsic conflict as a kind of double vision. Callard, in fact, goes on to discuss a parallel case of suffering from divided or split attention. Her central point is that, just as one cannot give all of one's attention to one's crying cat while writing a philosophy paper, although one might notice the beloved pet and utter soothing words to try to calm her down, one cannot get one's values in full view when one's valuational attentions are divided between two seemingly incommensurable ends, such as preserving a relationship and undermining it. And this highlights a crucial way in which a person who suffers from intrinsic conflict is unlike aesthetic Alan. For whereas Alan has resources to step back and deliberate about how he wants to resolve his extrinsic conflict, bitter Betty does not. Why not? Well, because, according to Callard, she cannot even, quote, raise the deliberative question, which of these two things should I do? Given that, quote, seeing one option as valuable gets in the way of seeing the other as valuable. And she continues, this again is because the self-monitoring activity connected to our valuing of one of the options requires us to reject the inclination to be attracted to the other. Those quotes come from page 129 and 131 respectively. But now on page 132, Callard gives us the upshot. Intrinsic conflicts are, quote, deliberatively irresolvable by being, in the first place, deliberatively unavailable. And this is because one simply can't hold the relevant normative reasons in view at the same time. In much the same way that I can't attend fully to both my cat and my computer in the very same moment, even if I can recognize the presence of both at once, and even feel them as competing with one another for my attentions. But getting both values in view will be a precondition for even attempting to decide between them based on their respective merits. So, the deliberative project can't even get off the ground in cases of genuine intrinsic conflict. Well, if I'm bitter Betty, and I can't deliberate my way out of my intrinsic conflict, then what can I do? You guessed it. On Callard's view, I can aspire. That is, on her telling, I can engage my capacity for proleptic rationality to temporarily resolve my psychological conflict in the hope that someday I'll actually be the kind of person for whom no such internal tension ever arises, because I will have come to grips with my core values in such a way that only one of the two that are causing me trouble today will be operative for me in future in relevantly similar scenarios. That is, I will actually have become a loving wife as a result of a potentially lengthy period of time in which I practice acting as a loving wife would in virtue of my self-monitoring. For example, maybe I don't even eye the trash can anymore when I go to the mail to do my husband a favor. And presumably, all of that will involve a good deal of aspirational self-pinching. Now, as an aside, I should note that although Callard never explicitly aligns her view with Aristotle, the process she describes has a very Aristotelian ring to me, a fact that I think most of you who are familiar with the Nicomachean Ethics or the Eudemian Ethics will not have failed to notice. In many parts of the book, the aspirant sounds quite like the continent person on Aristotle's view, the one who's striving to be virtuous by following in the footsteps of virtuous people, doing the things they do, thereby attempting to metabolize their reasons, emotions, and dispositions into second nature. Why Callard doesn't more explicitly align her account of aspiration with certain central Aristotelian tenets is a question I can't answer yet. But this might not be such a bad thing at this stage. For Callard reminds us that, quote, aspiration is a form of ethical movement, and nothing can move in a moment. That's on page 147. So too, slow reads are a form of conceptual movement. They bear a number of important similarities with aspirational endeavors, as these are described by Callard. Both take time, patience, work, and sometimes require a bit of self-pinching. In addition, in both cases, we can't be certain in advance of where they will go, how we will be changed, or whether the journey will have been worth it in the end. But slow reads are importantly unlike aspirational endeavors too, for we're not aspiring to adopt Callard's philosophical positions, but to understand them better. This means that it's appropriate to start to wonder at this point about the value of our still hazy conceptual end, as well as to challenge the building blocks a philosopher uses to get us there, even as we are still trying to learn by giving our intellectual mentor's work the most charitable read we can. So, if you're asking yourself questions like this, is bitter Betty really intrinsically conflicted, since she embraces an aspirational project to become more loving, which is already her dominant value? Or, how can bitter Betty be morally responsible if she does become more loving, given that her current self seems to be fractured from a valuational perspective? Then this is a good thing. And in fact, we'll pick up these queries in our next post when we consider some of the core issues that Callard addresses in part 3 of the book. So keep thinking up new questions. Thanks again for joining me once more, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.